The public narrative is fixated on the kinetic cost, the drone as a cheaper missile. This is a deliberate misdirection. The Defense Intelligence Unit is not offering $100 million for better explosions. It is funding a voice-controlled, AI-enabled swarm orchestrator, a conductor for a silent symphony. The doctrinal concepts being implemented, as observed in Ukraine and analyzed by the Small Wars Journal, are not focused on attrition. They are focused on paralysis. The primary vector for this is not an overt attack. It is systemic isolation. The weapon is not a warhead. The weapon is silence. A swarm doesn't need to destroy a satellite. It only needs to blind it. It doesn't need to sink a fleet. It only needs to sever its connection to command. The objective is to impose total sensory deprivation at a cost that is mathematically insignificant to the attacker, but systemically fatal to the target. This is the blueprint for creating a blind Leviathan, a nation-state with overwhelming military power, rendered inert, a carrier strike group with no orders, a launch-on-warning protocol with no signal, a financial system with no liquidity. It is the perfect vector for asymmetric escalation against a power already crippled by what analysts like Larry Klayman warn is increasingly violent internal political insolvency. In a world where, as Shashi Tharoor states, great powers lost moral compass and the international order is collapsing, this silent attack is the triggering mechanism. It forces the blind Leviathan into a zero-sum choice. Absorb the politically terminal humiliation of paralysis, or escalate vertically to restore deterrence. Systemic weakness is now the primary liability. The motive is not strength, it is insolvency. A nation-state, like a corporation, has a balance sheet. When the political cost of projecting conventional power exceeds its domestic political capital, the system becomes insolvent. It cannot afford the war it is fighting. The mission becomes a liability that threatens the stability of the regime itself. Examine the conflict in Ukraine. Analysis from strategic bodies like RUSI indicates the protracted ground war evolved into a severe domestic liability for the Kremlin. A conventional force structure designed for a short, decisive campaign instead generated a politically unsustainable rate of attrition. This is a solvency crisis materialized, a mathematical equation where the human and economic cost threatens to bankrupt the state's mandate to rule. Systemic weakness forces a pivot. A state facing political insolvency must either collapse or adapt. The adaptation is a calculated shift to asymmetric warfare. The primary objective is no longer territorial gain. It is the imposition of disproportionate kinetic cost with minimal domestic liability. As documented by Small Wars Journal, the evolution of drone warfare doctrine in Ukraine demonstrates this pivot in real time. It is a mathematical imperative, not a strategic choice. This strategic pivot thrives within a decaying international framework. As senior analysts like Shashi Tharoor have noted, the great powers appear to have lost their moral compass, effectively signaling the collapse of the post-Cold War order. This systemic decay creates the operational vacuum for new, more brutal protocols to become the standard. The old rules of deterrence no longer apply. Internal political insolvency is the primary vector for this new form of attack. Reports from observers like Larry Klayman, detailing escalating internal political violence and division within the United States, are not just domestic noise. For an adversary, this data signals a critical vulnerability. The blueprint is no longer to defeat a nation's military, but to apply precise, asymmetric pressure that pushes a politically fragile system past its breaking point, forcing it to either fracture or escalate. The response from systemic powers is an admission of this reality. The U.S. Defense Innovation Unit's $100 million prize for an AI-driven drone swarm orchestrator is not a research project. It is a launch-on warning protocol. It is a public declaration of entry into this new arms race, confirming that the autonomous, low-cost kinetic vector is now a permanent and central feature of strategic competition. The core of this new conflict blueprint is not ideology. It is a mathematical certainty rooted in economics. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, has modeled the emergent cost exchange ratio. A $5 million main battle tank is now a viable target for a $500 disposable first-person view drone. This is a 10,000 to 1 kinetic cost inversion. The math does not lie. This is the democratization of violence. Lethality is no longer the exclusive domain of state-level industrial military complexes. The barrier to entry for imposing catastrophic kinetic costs has been effectively zeroed out. Any non-state actor or failing state can now purchase systemic leverage off the shelf, weaponizing commercial technology against assets that represent decades of national investment. For the systemic power, this creates an inescapable solvency crisis. It is not the loss of a single tank. It is the politically and economically unsustainable rate of attrition. Defense systems designed for peer-to-peer conflict cannot counter a low-cost, high-volume swarm. Each defensive intercept costs orders of magnitude more than the attacking unit, guaranteeing the defender's economic collapse long before the attackers. This economic asymmetry forces a zero-sum choice. A nation-state facing this vector of attack cannot absorb these losses without triggering internal political insolvency. The only remaining protocol to restore deterrence is vertical escalation, a launch-on warning posture that migrates from conventional to unconventional weapon systems. Systemic weakness, therefore, becomes the primary accelerant toward a nuclear tripwire. The new blueprint for conflict is not being written in Washington or Beijing. It is being beta-tested in gray zones, systemically weak regions designated as proxy laboratories for the next generation of warfare. These are not targets, they are staging areas. The operational goal is to calibrate the kinetic cost of asymmetric escalation against a major power's political solvency. This is no longer theoretical. The Defense Innovation Unit's $100 million prize for a voice-controlled AI drone swarm orchestrator confirms the protocol. This isn't R&D, it is the industrialization of launch-on-warning swarm capability. The state is creating the very market for the technology that will be used to bleed it dry, turning a tactical tool into a systemic liability. The doctrine has already been validated. As documented by the Small Wars Journal, the drone warfare in Ukraine is a live-fire exhibition of Red Army doctrinal concepts adapted for the 21st century. It is a laboratory for calculating the exact ratio of low-cost kinetic assets required to neutralize high-value conventional systems. The math on attrition is now public. This external vector requires a pre-existing internal vulnerability. A nation-state crippled by what RUSI analysts term political insolvency becomes the ideal target. When internal factions create deep systemic fractures, as analysts like Larry Klayman warn, could lead to escalating violence, the nation's capacity to respond to external asymmetric threats collapses. The internal chaos is the beachhead. The entire architecture functions because the established international order is in a managed demolition. As Shashi Tharoor stated, the great powers lost moral compass. This is not a failure, it is a feature. The dissolution of post-war institutions removes the final firewall against this new model of conflict, creating a permissive environment for these gray zone operations to scale without consequence. The gray zone, therefore, is the intersection where political instability meets low-cost kinetic leverage. It is a laboratory for bankrupting a superpower, not with armies, but with 1,000 cuts delivered by autonomous systems. The objective is not to win the battle, but to force the adversary into a zero-sum solvency crisis. Systemic weakness, not military strength, is now the primary vector for attack. The doctrine is called Launch on Warning. It is not a choice, it is a protocol. A mathematical script activated by satellite and radar data indicating an incoming nuclear strike. The logic is brutal. Launch your own arsenal before the enemy's warheads impact and vaporize your ability to retaliate. The entire deterrence framework of a nuclear power rests on the certainty of that signal. Now, inject the fog of digital war. An adversary no longer needs to fire a physical missile to trigger this protocol. They only need to create the illusion of one. A sophisticated cyber attack, a digital ghost, can blind the early warning system. The screens go dark. The data feed is severed. The commander is now operating blind, with the decision window measured in minutes. Is this a system malfunction, or is it a deliberate blinding attack preceding a decapitation strike? To wait for verification is to risk the total destruction of your command structure. To follow the Launch on Warning protocol is to initiate global thermonuclear war based on a phantom. This is the new vector for asymmetric escalation. According to CSIS analysis, peer state doctrine, proven in conflict zones like Ukraine, now prioritizes blinding an enemy's command and control infrastructure. It's a systemic vulnerability. The Defense Innovation Unit's $100 prize for an AI-driven drone orchestrator is not for a better weapon. It's for an autonomous system capable of delivering precisely this kind of paralyzing digital strike. When a systemic power is crippled by what reports call a loss of moral compass or consumed by internal political violence, its decision-making loop shortens. The capacity for nuanced response evaporates. The fear of appearing weak forces an overreaction. An adversary doesn't need to win a conventional war. They only need to exploit the fear of digital blindness to force a zero-sum decision. They push the button by making you think they already have. The timeline for the first systemic shock is not a decade. It is a budget cycle. The Defense Innovation Unit's $100 prize for a swarm orchestrator is not a research project. It is a procurement order. These systems are moving from the doctrinal test beds of Ukraine, as analyzed by the Small Wars Journal, to off-the-shelf availability. The vector has been activated. The target selection protocol does not prioritize military assets. It prioritizes states exhibiting critical political insolvency. According to internal security analysts, the primary vulnerability is escalating domestic division, with warnings of factions becoming more and more violent to destabilize the system. This internal friction provides the perfect attribution shield for an external kinetic event. Expect the calibration shot within 12 months. The event will be a coordinated blackout of a key maritime logistics hub, such as the automated crane operations at the Port of Long Beach. A small, non-attributable swarm will execute a targeted strike on primary and backup power nodes. The kinetic cost will be a multi-billion-dollar supply chain seizure. The official narrative will blame domestic actors, leveraging the documented political chaos. The true adversary will simply collect the data on systemic response time and proceed to the next phase.